Crystal, I can see your picture.
You're live and I'm not there.
Okay, well, we miss you, Crystal. Crystal, I can see your picture.
You're live.
Remember that magical afternoon, the whole thing?
Hey friends, this is Elizabeth Woodson here with the TVCI team for our TVCI read along. We have been reading for the past few weeks Peter Lightheart's The Ten Commandments, a guide to the perfect law of liberty. And we are at the halfway point. So we, in the previous weeks, if you haven't watched the videos, you should go back and watch them because we had some great conversation. We talked about the first 5 commandments. And so this week, we are going to start with commandment number 6. And really, we've been talking about what does it mean for us to be the people of God, both individually and corporately, as we learn what it means to honor God and what it means to honor those who are made in his image. And so in this week, Peter opens up with an interesting comparison or observation about the structure. And so he tells us some things about the first 5 commandments and how they relate to the second 5 commandments, and then somehow how they mirror each other. So Nathan, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation, something that honestly before reading this chapter had not been something that I had thought deeply about. It's something that was kind of new to me in a lot of ways. And it's really fascinating. It's on page 76 if people are watching and you want to flip over and read along with us, where he kind of explains this. But the second paragraph there, it says the first and the second halves of the Decalogue, that's just the 10 words, the first and the second half of the Decalogue match one another. Idolatry is a species of murder. Murder, a kind of adultery, first and the 6th commandment. Worshipping images is a spiritual adultery, 2nd and 7th. Bearing God's name lightly steals his glory, the 3rd and the 8th. The Sabbath is for renewing covenant vows, 4th and 9th. Coveting undermines hierarchies necessary for healthy family, social, and political life, 5th and 10th. And that idea that I think Dr. Lightheart is showing us there is there's this sort of ebb and flow, this sort of back and forth, even built into those 10 words, that the 1 and the 10 are paralleling each other, and the 2 and the 9 and so forth, as you're kind of getting into the middle. And for some of us, maybe this is a new way of seeing these 10 words, but as I'm thinking about it, I mean, I'm thinking the way that Jesus summarized the whole law and the prophets. What did he say? He said, all the law and prophets is this, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think Dr. Lightheart is picking up on this this tradition of viewing the 10 words in 2 tablets, right? I think even on the front cover of the book, right, there's 2 tablets, which they might divide it different ways. And Dr. Lightheart talked about that earlier in the book. But this is one of the ways that you can divide it, is in the first 5, talking about love for God. And the second 5, talking about love for others. And in both instances, when we sin against our fellow man, we're really sinning against God. And so love for God should lead to love for brother. And when we don't have love for brother, it shows that we actually don't have love for God. And so that's a really interesting idea that was kind of new to me. Maybe it's kind of new to some of you. Yeah, what did you guys think? Was that new to you, or had you heard that before?
I think I'd heard the first 5, love God, and the second 5, love people, but not the mirroring. That was new to me.
Yeah.
And I think because it helps us not say, oh, this doesn't apply to me. Like he does it every chapter. Dr. Lightheart will talk about, hey, you think it doesn't apply to you, but it actually does. And just the interconnectedness of all the commands. And then somehow they're building a corporate identity or an individual identity in God, but it is, you can't get away from any of these, because to break one in some sense is to break them all, which is what scripture says.
I was just thinking about this. So I have a Kindle version of it as well, and I didn't have my book today. I was at the office, so I was reading on my Kindle versions, looking at my highlights. He's doing consistently, I think this is just him, and I really enjoy it. I think in one of the first weeks we talked about this book, I said, I love his writing because he hits a point and then he just stays on the point and just works it down. And the only thing I can think of is when someone's working on a knot in a muscle and they hit the pain point and you're like, okay, you can let go of that if you want. And that person is like, no, I actually have to press deeper and then trace it down to get it to go away. And it's what he's doing in each of these chapters. Mm-hmm. And so in just a couple pages over, and again, I don't have it highlighted in my book, but he gets to a point where he's like, it's on page 78. He's like, you might be feeling some relief right about now. At least here is one commandment you've never broken. Not really, not in any serious way. And the next sentence he goes, but don't let yourself off so easily. You're like, oh, okay. And he just continues to work through it to show us how like these commandments work out in so many different implications within daily life. And I just appreciated the thoughtful treatment of it. And like you said, Elizabeth, the parallelism and being able to connect them through love of God and love of neighbor. But as you respect the image of God in your neighbor, you're honoring God in ways that he's commanded you to. It was really encouraging.
Yeah.
And he brings this idea out of talking about our definition, our English, probably American definition of murder, and how in some sense it's a little bit more narrow than what the biblical authors are talking about. And so what I appreciated, which was also something new to me, is how the rest of the 5 in some sense are all some version of murder or the assault of the image of God. And so really placing this high value on us as image bearers, and the different ways in which we assault that image, whether it is murder or adultery or the other ones we'll talk about tonight and the rest of the weeks. And just, I think I appreciate the depth of explanation to help create this idea that maybe we just gloss over, which also adds to us saying that this doesn't apply to me.
Yeah, and I think Jesus is kind of the classic example, right? In the Sermon on the Mount where, you know, kind of like you mentioned earlier, Mason, like, yeah, this is the one that most of us probably, and I don't want to say all of us, because there might be someone watching us who maybe has engaged in the sin of murder in a physical way. But most of us probably haven't actually physically murdered someone. But Jesus, right, in the Sermon on the Mount says, hey, you heard it said that you should now murder. I say, don't be angry with someone in your heart. And all of us surely have fallen into that. And it's like that idea of even anger as being something that violates the 6th commandment is something that I think we don't talk about very often. Like I'm reminded of Mr. Rogers, which I don't know if have you guys seen the It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood documentary? Yeah. Oh man, it's beautiful. It's such a wonderful like little documentary on Mr. Rogers' life, which if you're not familiar, Mr. Rogers was the children's programmer on PBS. It's actually, just as a reminder, I have like this little figurine of Mr. Rogers just to remind me to be compassionate.
Do you pick these out before the session?
No,
I feel like he does. He's like, what can I reference tonight on my shelf?
Too. I'm not going to mention Gandalf, but I have him as well. I just have a lot of things.
Too late. Like, already did. Yeah.
Look, I like trinkets. Anyway, Mr. Rogers, it's a really famous event that happened like in 1969 when PBS was undergoing some questions from the Senate about whether they should keep their public funding for public television. And Mr. Rogers appears before one of the senators. I think his name was like Mr. Pastore or something like that. But anyway, he's like grilling him. He's just like this really hardened sort of man. And Mr. Rogers talks about a song that he had wrote for children, a song that he had wrote called "What Do You Do with the Mad That You Feel?" Like when there was something like when you're so mad that you
can you sing that song, Nathan? Can you sing that?
I don't know if I can sing that one.
Okay.
But he talked like Mr. Rogers talks in there.
Tiger version.
Do you? Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So like he talks in there about how Mr. Rogers is trying to get kids to understand that our feelings are mentionable and manageable.
Yeah.
And
that's a great line.
And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about our feelings. We don't talk about that feeling of anger. So what do we do with the mad that we feel? Because we all certainly feel the feeling of anger in different ways. But what do we do with it? And I think Mr. Rogers is helping us to name that.
He says anything that's mentionable is manageable. Anything that's manageable is human. I think that's what he says. And I remember that line at the end of I think it was the Tom Hanks movie where they talked about it and he says it. And I was like, oh my gosh. But even to think about that, like there are some things that you feel where like to confess the anger in a certain way towards a person, like, wait, that's unmentionable. I can't do that. It's like, no, like it is mentionable and then it is therefore manageable and you can work through it because it's part of human experience. And if you ignore or hide your anger, it will fester.
Yes. Why do you think, because when I think about anger in Christian culture, they seem opposite of one another. Kind of like this culture of niceness. Like, oh, to be a super spiritual Christian is to be nice. Why do you all think that is? Well, we've gotten to this place of we ignore our anger, or in some sense, say to be angry is to not be Christian.
That's a good question. I mean, my mind immediately goes to the Psalms, right? We're preparing to teach the Psalms this fall in TVCI. And I think of the imprecatory Psalms, which is a big word for, just saying the Psalms of curses, right? They're the David and others, but they're the angry ones, right? There's a place for righteous anger. And even Jesus, he takes the whip and he's driving people out of the temple. But I think it's something we've already talked about in our previous discussion of Surprised by Paradox with lament. I think the modern evangelical American church just isn't good with talking about lament. And I think lament and talking about anger or righteous anger are kind of intertwined in some ways, because there are some things that are both lamentable and things of which we should be righteously angry. And we can all think of many examples, even that are happening right now in our culture. But again, we want to, like you said, Elizabeth, we want to put on this smiley face, like happy clappy sort of. We don't even have the song to sing to express this anger. Like, you have plenty of songs in the secular, quote unquote, sphere that express anger, but we don't really have many angry songs or songs express our anger in the church. And I don't know why that is.
Because you do
I wonder if it has something.
Go ahead, Nick. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead. You're going to wait for me.
I think some. I'll go ahead. I realized. Oh no, we're live on air with people. I wonder if there's like something to do with just the current culture in our era, where tolerance is the cultural value, and so like I can't be angry and express displeasure with you because it might shame you, or it might tell you that I think I disagree, or I'm making a moral judgment. And when like making a judgment on something is a normal part of human life, of like, hey, it's either right or wrong, it's good or bad, I do it or I don't. But there's the sense of like, hey, you can't do that to me because that's not right, that's intolerant, or it's not okay. Also, I think I've heard one writer call it Minnesota nice, like everything's okay because there's this shell, this exterior that we need to keep. No offense for anyone who's listening from Minnesota, I'm sure you're a wonderful person. But it's like, everything's okay. Like, it's a social grace that I need to just keep my veneer up. And that's why when we do, sorry, I was reading a comment that someone put in. When we do like a call to worship, or someone asking how you doing, like, oh, I'm fine. And it's like, no, I know you're not fine. Like, I know you're not okay because I know what's going on in your life. Sit down, tell me why you're not, like, why you think your burden is too big for me to bear as your friend. And I think there's also this thing where we just feel shame that we're not perfect, and we don't want to let somebody else help bear our burden. And so if that's anger, we feel shame when we're being angry, because Christians who have been forgiven are supposed to be people who also deal with anger, which is not true. That's a lie. But we feel that on a cultural level in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think one thing that really impacted me is on page 79, where Lightheart breaks down all the ways that anger kind of has its tentacles in everything. And at the bottom of the page, after that Luther quote, he says, anger can dominate one's life, churning beneath the surface and breaking through at the slightest provocation. A child's embarrassing accident, pressure at work, a traffic jam. You say you're ambitious, but what looks like ambition is envy, the desire to take down the competition. Deep down, you're a murderer. And it goes on talking about plain speaking, right? Being a leader in all these different ways. Yeah. And I think anger is one of those root emotions. Anger is one of those root, it's not always sin, but sometimes when it is, it's a root sin. And I mean, I think about like ambition and envy. I mean, for me and my personality, ambition is something that like I really highly value. And I hope in a good way, Dave Harvey has that, godly ambition book. I hope there's godly ambition, but there's also sinful ambition in my heart. And sometimes I find that the root is in anger. It's the root in anger of, being overlooked or whatever it is in me, but it's anger, which leads to envy, which then leads to ambition. And then, it goes out from there. And I think one of the reasons we don't talk about it is because it is a root issue and it hurts. like that quote, when I came across it on page 79, it was just like, oh man, like that, like that really convicted me. It convicted me of my own sin. And I don't like to talk about my sin. I don't like to engage with things that are actually hard. Like I can talk about not being mad in traffic all day, like about traffic jams. We can talk about that. It's an easy thing. But talking about being angry that I'm being for Mason, maybe not, but But it's not a simple solution, right? It's something that takes years of work, years of counseling, and talking with friends and bearing one of those burdens, like you talked about, Mason. But I saw that idea of anger. Yeah.
I think you're right. And Brittany Logan puts a question in here where he's got a quote that says, anger curves inward into self-hatred, cleverly disguising itself as humility. I always thought of anger as not working with pride. What did you think of the association with shame? And Brittany, Kurt Thompson, in his book, The Soul of Shame, which is a great book for those of you who are listening. This is Mason's Resource Hour with book recommendations. So The Soul of Shame by Kurt Thompson would be something you should read. I'm just going to type it into the notes here so you see it. And Kurt talks about, he just uses this line that has always stuck with me. He said, shamed people shame people. And I think about people who are shamed, who feel a sense of unworthiness, or they don't trust themselves, or they're not good enough, and whatever, giving them that message in life, there is a self-hatred and an anger of, I wish this was different. I'm mad that this was my experience. How do I get out of this? I feel helpless. I feel trapped. And that can work its way out in anger towards other people. And it is not like you could not be doing anything wrong, or you could do something wrong, but the response is completely inordinate. And when you notice that someone's response is inordinate, whether that's yourself or someone that you love or someone you're interacting with, it's always good just to stop and go, okay, like the punishment didn't fit the crime. So something's going on. And I'm not going to, like, I'm going to treat this person with empathy and compassion, because if you've ever felt that way where you know you are over responding, you are not acting rationally. And so engaging with someone with compassion in that moment and trying to think through what may have triggered them, what false script they've learned and are acting out, there's a way to treat them with empathy and compassion to help them relearn over time what just a right response to that feeling of shame is. Kurt does a great job in his book walking through that and how the church is actually the healing community for that.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I don't have more past that. Sorry, you can keep going.
Something else that I thought of, just as another way to apply the sixth commandment is talking about in Deuteronomy, right? Where it talks about building a parapet around your roof, which I never really heard the word parapet until.
Did you find parapet, Nathan?
Can you spell it too?
Could you?
No doubt. I could not
spell and define. Use it in a sentence.
How does the line go? Oh man, I'm blanking on it. I can imagine it the way it's happening. It's like a young man leaning over the parapet. Like he's like waving a white flag. I don't know. It's in Hamilton, if you know. Anyway, a parapet is a fence around a roof. And but Deuteronomy talks about whenever you build a new home to build a parapet or a fence around your roof, because you don't want to be guilty of unintentionally killing someone by someone falling off your roof. And I think that's really interesting. Again, we talked about before, like with the 10 Commandments, how they're representative but not exhaustive. It's like the 10 Commandments are representative and do not murder, do not kill, or manslaughter, kind of like you kind of talked about in the first chapter. But it builds on it later. And in Deuteronomy, it builds on it in saying that part of the commandment of the sixth commandment is not unintentionally murdering people. And so I thought about like, hey, if you are a car manufacturer, part of what it looks like for you to apply the sixth commandment to your work is making sure it's a safe car to drive, making sure there's seatbelts in the car, making sure it passes all the inspections, right? And you can think about many other different, whatever sphere of work you're in, you can apply every one of the commandments to your sphere of work. And I thought like, that's one thing that thinking about those unintentional ways that we could lead to manslaughter and avoiding those things and actively seeking to protect our fellow man because they're made in the image of God.
I mean, see passivity versus being passive versus active. And so it's not that, hey, I don't do these things. It's what are you doing to promote the life and safety of other people? And I think we could use that same type of comparison for the rest of the commandments.
Yeah, I think it's so helpful.
Let's talk about before we leave this commandment on page 80. It talks about second full paragraph. It said Jesus doesn't forbid anger. Righteous outrage is real, as Jesus' action will demonstrates. Jesus requires a righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, a righteousness like Jesus' own. Jesus doesn't merely avoid wrong. He is an active righteousness that triumphs over evil. Elizabeth, when we read Surprised by Paradox, was that the book where she was talking about anger at injustice and lament of injustice? And I think you and I were talking about, Nathan, we might have mentioned it. Like, it was one of the first times that I had thought about Christ's righteous anger and his frustration and lamenting with injustice in the world, where, like, I don't know, I just think the way that, one of the ways that Jen, this is my daughter Piper coming in, knock over a light. Hey, sweetheart, I'm on a live call with people. Okay. Okay, hold on one second, guys. This is COVID.
You're fine.
Hey, Piper, you need to.
And I think kind of this idea that we hold the image of God in such high regard that we have a righteous anger when that image is assaulted in any way.
Yes.
And so I think our lack of anger or a lack of lament shows a lack of honor for the image of God, because we're not concerned when something that represents the nature and character of God has been offended or assaulted in culture. And we're just have stood by and let it happen and continue to let it happen. And so this connected response.
I think that I was picking up on in Jen's work was I had just not sat there and done the work of thinking through, well, that's the Imago Dei. There's injustice being treated the Imago Dei. And therefore, Christ, who values the Imago Dei, is righteously angry and unhappy and wanting to set right the injustice.
Yeah. And
I really appreciated the way that Jen wrote about that. And I think the two have connected well as over the summer as we've dealt with the issue.
Yeah. And I think it because that righteous anger disrupts things that make us feel really uncomfortable. And so I think we're like, oh, it should all be kind of level. We shouldn't feel this level of discomfort in our relationship, lived out relationship with the Lord. And that causes us to say, hey, let's just be nice. Let's just keep everything the way it should be. But that we need to lean into that discomfort sometimes to honor the image. And so I think sometimes as Christians, we block ourselves from doing that because we feel a way that we think is not Christian.
Yeah. Just to sneak 2 Broadway shows into one live stream. When I was a kid, I was in a show called Children of Eden. And
so you were in it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I forget who I was. I was young Abel, young Cain. I forget which one I was. That's important, I guess. Which one I am.
Like which one?
Yeah, I was the good guy or the bad guy. I forget which one. But anyway, I can't recommend it wholesale because I haven't seen it in a really long time. But the idea is it's a musical interpretation of the book of Genesis and of the creation story. But I remember there was a really powerful scene where Cain murders his brother Abel. And like it's just like this, like, what have you done? Like in song, but it's like, what have you done? And it's like this like gut wrenching, the lights all come down, whatever, however they do it in that particular theater. Like that idea of the very first sin east of Eden was murder. And that's really significant. That Cain, because of his jealousy, because of his attempt to control God, which is what he was doing by trying to bring the sacrifice and get God to do what he wants and get God's pleasure by his sacrifice, he was jealous at his brother and lashes out in murder, and his blood cries out from the ground. I think it's just really significant. And even, in Genesis 9, which Peter Whiteharter talked about at the beginning of the chapter, about after the flood, like the grounding for not murdering people from that point on was the maintenance of the image of God, which is also really important. But I'll just say, like, I think you're right, Mason, that there is something to this righteous anger that the Lord feels in Jesus as the still embodied God-man, seated at the right hand of the Father, forever God and man together, feels that anger as well. And so, like you said, Elizabeth, when our image bearer brothers and sisters are slighted or marginalized or murdered, that we should feel a similar sort of righteous anger.
I think there's also this temptation that, like, I just want to always believe I'm righteous when I'm angry. Any of y'all? Like when I get mad,
Yeah.
it is I am much more prone to be like, oh no, I am mad for all of the right reasons.
Mm.
And I'm going to enumerate the list of reasons why it is okay for me to be angry. And what I have to realize is thinking through like, oh no, I need to wait a couple of minutes for my brain chemistry to resettle and for me to like come out of adrenaline mode, which is self-defense fight mode, and then to think, okay, there's other things at work here. And how many of us will put our foot in our mouth, hurt people, work through things when we just go right into, oh no, I'm going to tell you why this is okay for me to be angry. And that's just not, it doesn't bring about the kind of life that God desires for us, but we're so prone to it.
Yeah,
Right, he
out of the
talks
mouth
about
speaks the
how-
overflow of the heart.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some of the times too, when we like are angry, we say, oh, I didn't mean it, you know, or I was just angry. I didn't mean what I said. But like that scripture Jesus saying, like, no, you have it in you, and you have it deep down there. So like you can't blame it on your anger. So I think that's really wise to stop and to pause and to come back. Like you said, when your brain chemistry is different, when your blood pressure is down, and say, okay, now let's talk about it, because we will say what we think.
The sixth word demands we be peacemakers, sons of God, like the Son. So, hey, it's 8:30. Why don't you want to move on? We'll turn the page and go to the seventh commandment. Does that work?
Yeah.
Commandment. Since you're the only married person on this call, you want to tee this one up, Mason?
Okay. All right. Let me get to where I highlighted things. I actually thought about this afternoon as I was reading on this call. The only married one, are they going to make me walk through it? And I like how that was your first thing that you went to. Appreciate that. Hold on, let me get over here. So I'm looking at this, and I think what I liked about Dr. Lightheart in this chapter is he kind of goes through, and like I said, he traces that line. He's like, surely you get an inch. Like, surely you get a little bit of room to have your cake and eat it too, to try and be faithful, but to scratch a desire, to be mostly good, but to step outside the line sometimes. And he just faithfully goes to every cultural kind of, I don't know what the right word is, like assumption, and says, no, holiness. Like holiness. This is what this is. This is not modeled. This is not confused. It is clear. This is the call. Because in the call to holiness, in the call to heterosexual marriage, it is a unified picture of the image of God as he has made it. And I just appreciated his clarity on it. And then as he walked through and said, surely you're going to think, man, I can cheat a little bit here and it's okay. And in this instance, it's like really the word cheat. And he's like, no, like it's not okay. And in a day and age where I don't think it has ever been more simple or more quick, outside of just being near another person, but to access any type of information, image, like fantasy. This call was just, I just really appreciated it where he was like, no, this is it.
Yeah.
You don't give sin an inch because it'll take a mile. Like it'll just keep going. And the call to holiness, you are representing to the world in honoring the image of God in your conduct. Is that enough of a rant? Sorry. I just really appreciated what he did.
Yeah. And this is one of the major sins of our culture of the day. I mean, you think of the 1960s sexual revolution that kind of is still working its way out today. Like I have a friend who says that today in our culture, we either treat sex like a god or a grocery. In that he means we treat it as if it's everything or if it's nothing. Like all I need in life is to find satisfaction. Like I need to be with who I want. I need to be with them however often I want or in whatever situation I want. It's God or it's grocery. All means nothing. I can just get on some dating app, swipe through, hook up with someone. It means nothing. It's just physical bodies. But scripture, I think, again, going to that mirror of the seventh commandment and the second commandment. The second commandment is, don't make any graven image, right? Why? Because we are the image of God, which we just talked about. A human being, I mean, I think of in Corinthians, I don't know if it's first or second, I forget which one, but I'm talking about sexual sins or sins that you don't, that you commit against others and against your own body. And so like there's this way in which sexual sin isn't just harming of self, but it's harming of someone else and the community in general. I think he talks about that too, about how it's a communal sin. But yeah, this is one of the big things, and we either treat it like it's too much or not enough.
And I think he opens up the chapter, kind of piggybacking on what you said, Nathan, about the way that we treat sex. This idea of sexual autonomy. So it's my body, and I can do it what I want to. And when we think about sex as a sin, a sexual sin, as something again that we do against our own body, it's just like, you don't belong to yourself. And he unpacks this in the next commandment in some really cool ways. But it's just the idea of it's first not about you. There are blessings for the Lord has gifted to us, but in terms, but in terms of priority,
tell me why it's not, Elizabeth.
I don't really want to expound upon that comment because I actually don't remember what I just said.
You said it's not about you, and I said what?
What? It's not about you.
Keep going.
It's not about you.
Keep going.
But I appreciated the theological connections made in this chapter about how he says it on 89 that sex is created as a sign of God's love for his bride. It reminds us of the covenant relationship that God has with us as his people and the fidelity of that covenant relationship. And so there is representation that sex has beyond just our personal pleasure. It's not about us because we don't belong to us. And it shifts the entire way you think about it when you realize that you don't have per se over how your body is used.
Well, and I think that was the key comment you made that I reacted to facetiously was it's like you are not your own. You were bought with a price and you're made in the image of God. Therefore, what you do matters outside of how it makes you feel because you bear the weight of the name of God as a child of God. And so if you think about baggage that you have from sin within your life, and the scriptures talk about how like you're committing sin against yourself and your body is the temple of God, like Holy Spirit's in you. And to treat this lightly, like if you just connect it with what he's saying here, I resonated so much when he talked about this. Like you said, we don't want to, no spoilers for the next chapter, but as it was like, you're not your own. And far, far too often, whether it be with what we eat or drink, how we exercise or take care of ourselves, how we treat our bodies, we act like we are our own. And we can get out of shape mentally, physically, or emotionally for fit service to our King. And part of this is how we treat like the image of God in ourselves and other people. And yeah, I just think it's a beautiful way that he's walked through it.
Yeah, one of those things that is kind of ancillary to this, kind of attached to the side of it, is the way that we over-sexualize in our culture, which I think also kind of fits in with the seventh commandment, where attraction is everything. Attraction is king. It's about being beautiful. And kind of like what you said, Mason, like there's this tension between taking care of yourself, exercising, knowing that your body doesn't just belong to you. Like there's that tension. On the other side, you have like fat shaming, you have body shaming, you have certain images of women in magazines, right, who are like photoshopped, or like a certain skin tone is desirable or not desirable, right, or certain hairstyle, instead of just saying, no, this is who God has made me to be, and it's a beautiful thing. I'm not looking to be attractive to everyone. So I think that's something that our culture really wrestles with as well, is this idea of over-sexualization, is that we want beautiful people on our stages. We want beautiful people to tell us what to do. That's why we have this kind of cult of celebrity in our society. We have these celebrity crushes. These things are these sort of acceptable sins that we are fine with, but what is it doing? But it's reducing someone down to just being a sexual being. Like we have to recognize that part of what it means to be made in the image of God, part of what it means to be human, is to have sexuality. That's part of humanity. And every single person who's ever lived, including Jesus, is a sexual being. That doesn't mean Jesus lived out his sexuality in the way that we typically think. He lived a chaste, abstinent life. Same with the Apostle Paul, right? Or others who are single and so forth. But the idea is that every single person who has a body is a sexual being. So we're not less than that, but we are certainly more than that. But one of our cultural sins is to reduce people to just their sexuality, to what they look like, and how attractive they are. And that's a major issue.
Yeah. So talk about that, so on our team, we have 3 females and 2 males, and we're all friends, and we're good friends. And talk about how, like, we have really worked hard at friendships, but how for many times, like I know we were talking about Amy Bird's book, Why Can't We Be Friends? That talks about this issue of like the difficulty between male and female relationships in the church, because they often are hypersexualized to where it's, oh, these 2 people can't be friends because they've become really friends, and something's going to happen. And everyone just assumes that it's going to be adulterous, or if they're not married, like they're just going to fall into sin. Instead of, hey, there's kind of wise barriers for friendships that are cross-gender, but they can be friends.
Yeah.
And talking through what it is, like what it is to have friendship that is non-sexualized. You want to comment about that? Because we deal with that in our team and in our church as being complementarian.
I think for me, because when it comes to the over-sexualization of genders in the church, sometimes I think it happens to both men and women. But I think often women get the short end of the stick because it means we get left out of places. So we get left out of conversations. I love Billy Graham, but the rule in where we will and will not go. And so I think that we always seek to be people who walk in wisdom. But what is it like for women to be brought into opportunities to be developed as leaders, to be trained, to just be brought into different types of, just to go out to lunch and have a good time? We do that as a team. Yeah. Every week, we're going out to lunch, we're having these kind of conversations. And I know some women at other churches who that would not happen for them. Mm-hmm. And how I've been grown, I've been stretched, I've been challenged to think differently and to be different because I've been around specifically Nathan and Mason, and just how much of a privilege that is because we value the person and what they bring and what we need from them in terms of our personal development and what we can give over kind of the sexualization of what might happen if something goes left.
And that's so essential. Like, I was going to say, even this week, Elizabeth and I were on a Zoom call, like a million Zoom calls, like I'm sure everyone is. And Elizabeth, because we're friends, we've been friends for a while, she knows the things that, I need help in. And she just texted me and she's like, hey, like, just watch out for this. And I so appreciated that because it's something that I think as a man, I'm not excusing it. It was like, as a man, like that's something I wouldn't have seen. But Elizabeth, because she is a sister in Christ and she's a godly, mature sister in Christ who knows me, she was like, hey, bro, it's like, chill out. And then we call and talk later. It's like, hey, just tell me what you think. Like, I need to learn from you, And like that sort of female voice is so necessary in my life because if I was in a room of all men, I don't think what I was doing would have been called out. What I was doing would have been, oh, that's just how men, that's how men are interacting with other people. But I need to be called to gentleness and to slow down, right? And to be gracious and kind, right? And Elizabeth called me out on my sin, and I appreciate that, And like that's the narrative we need to tell, because I think one of the big issues, I loved my time in seminary, but one of my classes in seminary, or both my undergrad and my MDiv, my pastoral ministry classes, I remember the story is just told almost every single class of the adulterous woman. There would be the story of, Joe was my former student, and Joe was on this motorcycle ride with this woman who was not his wife, and now they had an affair, and now it's not a ministry anymore. Don't do that. And then now there's a story about someone who's now a vacuum salesman. And like that narrative is the prime narrative that's told, at least in my experience, in the seminaries that I was involved in.
It's fear, not maturity.
Exactly.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to finish my thought and say, rather than the story that I hope that we embody in TVCI, and it's something that is probably one of my favorite things about our teen culture, is that we're genuinely just brothers and sisters, and we care for one another, and we can be genuine friends as men and women. And like that's a story that needs to be told. That is possible, and it's beautiful.
So, 2 quick anecdotes on this. First one is I was sitting with a staff member outside of our team years ago, and we were talking, and we were talking about this conversation, and she said, "Listen, if you come into a conversation with me and you bring fear that I am out to sleep with you, out to ruin your walk, out to trip you up or make you lust, like that on me. That is not coming from me. And so that is an issue in your heart. And we were talking about trying to deal with some leaders in the church working through things. And we were trying to figure out how to have this conversation. And she articulated so well where I was like, this is great to be able to say just very clearly, like, if that's an issue in your heart, don't put that on your sister, because what that does to your sister is wrong and unjust. And it really is an immaturity and a need for grace and growth in the heart of that person to go, this is about me, it's not about this person. And I need to grow here and be able to see this person as a child of God that they are, and not sexualize this. Second thing, Elizabeth, I know that you are familiar with Ruth Haley Barton, and you've read some of her work. So have I. I know that she and we would disagree on some things, probably some big buckets of things. But as I listened to a topic, they talked about brothers and sisters in ministry together, and she talked about this, like the moment where you're serving alongside somebody in ministry, and you find them and you just go, man, that is awesome. And then you realize there's an attraction, and your cultural norm is to romanticize that attraction and to go, no, that's not right. What you're seeing there is the beauty of God in that person on display. It is not the sexualized nature that our culture would put on it. And so being able to recognize that for what it is, and to not feel shame or disgust with yourself, but to just go, that's not what that is. And I'm going to walk away from that thought, but I'm going to praise God that that person has that gift, or that's Christ on display in that person. I think the ability to handle that nuance is lacking for a lot of people, and it trips them up to where they're either like, oh my gosh, why did I think that? I can't believe I thought that. Or they don't know how to handle a friendship with that person, so they just avoid that person altogether. Yeah, those are my two anecdotes about that. Those things have both helped train me and how to care for people and think of them.
Mason, before we jumped on this call, you pulled down one of our favorite shared works that we all love.
Oh, did I? Did
Yeah.
I pull it right here?
Every Moment Holy, and you read a liturgy in there. Was it the liturgy of
Yeah.
Seeing a Beautiful Person? Would you mind reading that again? Because I think that's really helpful.
Just so happens my place marker is still there, so it's fine.
But I don't plant
Elizabeth,
things; they're just there.
Listen,
I don't show anything on the call. I don't pull out books. I don't pull out trinkets. I just show myself. And sometimes I feel like
correction. You just always have great earrings. That's what you bring. That's what you bring.
On point.
So that's okay. And everyone's here to listen to you anyway, so it's okay. We just feel like we need props. So here's the thing. In the back of Every Moment Holy, there is a liturgy called Upon Seeing a Beautiful Person. And when I read this for the first time, I just thought, man, what a great short prayer. If you're ever tempted to see, when you see a person that you think that person is beautiful, and you're just tempted to consume them rather than appreciate them, or to give attribution to where their beauty came from. So this is it. Upon seeing a beautiful person, Lord, I praise you for divine beauty reflected in the form of this person. Now train my heart so that my response to their beauty would not be twisted downward into envy or desire, but would instead be directed upward in worship of you, their creator, as was your intention for all such beauty before the breaking of the world. Which sounds great.
Yeah, that's so good. It reminds me, just in a small way, last year, everything's kind of, not last year, the year before, we taught through the book of Samuel. And Saul, if you remember him, the very first king of Israel, why was he chosen? But because he was attractive, because he was beautiful, because he was a head and shoulders taller than everyone, he was handsome. And I think that's another impulse of, upon seeing a beautiful person, that I think we also have to check in our own heart is what Israel did is they saw a beautiful person, and maybe it was envy. Maybe it was desire, or those things that, the rabbit room people mentioned. But they elevated Saul to a place that he shouldn't have been simply because of what he looked like. And I think we have to be careful about that. We have to be careful about saying, man, that person has it together. Like their shirts are ironed and, they have a chiseled jaw, or whatever standard of beauty we imagine someone to have, and say, oh, that person needs to be up front. And it may be true, because David even was described as being, ruddy, right? Or like ruggedly handsome. So he was still a handsome man. But think about those who are marginalized. Think about those who are revolting to our culture, who you wouldn't see on the cover of a magazine, like Jesus, right? He was stricken and smitten that nobody desired him. Nobody thought he was beautiful. Would we put someone like that on a stage? Would we put someone on a stage who people would turn away from or stare at or things like that? Or are we, desiring or being envious of someone just because of the way they look and putting them on a pedestal like Saul, who that didn't really turn out too well?
Yeah. It's so interesting. Like I've thought about this often of just how we are so drawn to characters like Saul throughout history, and that we love unwavering confidence. Like if someone is just able to lay down a statement, get in, they're just like, no, this is it, get behind it, we're going. Like we just flock to that kind of person. And I've often wondered, like, as someone who, as an Enneagram 6 who does not make those statements very often, I have often just thought, why is that those personalities are the ones that we're like, yeah, put that person up front. And it is just it's such a tendency to notice in our own hearts how we want certainty and we're willing to follow people who feel certain. And that is such a dangerous thing. So we are way off topic from adultery with that comment. So maybe we should go on to the last commandment that we're going to cover tonight. Shall we do that?
Good call. Even there on that first page, on page 95, I think that is just a good reminder before we move on in the discussion, where at the end of the first paragraph it says, like adultery, theft is a variety of murder. I think that's really good. Like you mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, that's kind of everything that follows in the second half of the 10 words is a breaking down of murder. It's a form of murder, and theft is a form of murder. That was interesting. Yeah, I think on that next page on 96, kind of building on that idea, Lightheart says, third paragraph, even so, we become emotionally attached to our things. What we are includes what we have. To own something is to incorporate it into your personality. It talks earlier about, if you're house sitting for someone or watching someone's things, like you have to guard it like it's your own. And we can't treat people's things flippantly because what people own and have is part of what makes them them, right? And so when we disregard their things, either by taking them, being envious of them and taking them for our own gain, or we just destroy them, another form of theft, we're disrespecting that person who that represents.
I mean, it was just so good. Like at the bottom of page 96, he talks about in the Torah, the first specific law about theft is a prohibition of kidnapping or man-stealing.
Yeah. We
can steal another person by enslaving him, unjustly imprisoning him, coercing his productivity, manipulating an employee to accept lower than reasonable pay. And I worked with a guy once, a biblical counselor. He put things in such a great way, but he would often say, like, when you won't allow someone to be themselves, I'm butchering it, when you won't allow someone to be themselves in their relationship with you, then you're mostly just using them. And like, it's so easy to use people for your own ends. And so you think about the way that you can cut off, curtail, or ignore the image of God in people because you are not aware of what you're doing, or you're very aware of it and you don't care, because the ends that you're looking for are what is the priority for you over the Imago Dei and them being honored. And that's just rampant. Like but to categorize that as stealing, I think is really important, to be able to say, this is theft. Like, it's theft from that person's dignity. Their inherent dignity is being in the image of God. And you owe it to them to not do that.
I think of the scripture of a worker is worthy of his wages, or don't muzzle an ox when it's treading grain, or even in pastoral ministry of Paul says that someone who should be worthy of double honor, which is a monetary term. So someone's worthy of double honor who labors in teaching and preaching, right? And I think sometimes we do it in our culture where we think that stealing intellectual property is okay. Like most of us probably wouldn't go to a store and try to like take a TV. No, but I'm saying like that's a thing that it's like a socially acceptable sin. Like, or you think of like, you remember like LimeWire or like Napster back in the early 2000s? Yeah, I mean, like I'm probably hitting too
Yeah,
close.
but
Like
dude,
I'm
you were
probably
like,
hitting close.
what do you know about Napster?
Yeah, but like that's a thing, right? Of stealing music or stealing art or like people's intellectual property, and we think that's not something that we can actually steal, because we're not going to steal a TV at a store, but we are probably might be more likely to steal someone's intellectual property, and that's still not okay.
Yeah, I think I mean, you make a really good point there, because at some point, with everything being made digital, we thought, oh, it's digital, I have access to it. So copyright is not a thing, or going, I should pay that person, or I should ask that person. Like, it's not just plagiarism, it's theft. And it happens so easily in a lot of spaces. And there's a lot of spaces where you're like, well, I got it for free, so it's okay. And no, that's content someone's created. So,
I mean, he hints to that at the end of the first-ish paragraph on 97. The golden rule encompasses property as well as personal relations. You love your enemy by caring for his property as you would have him care for yours. And so you talked about it, Nathan, just the interconnectedness between our property and who we are, and that we're actively seeking to help someone flourish. So I think this is another place in where I saw that tension between, we might approach it passively, and it's like, how are you actively not stealing from people, whether it is tangible or intangible things?
Yes. And one of those ways too that we don't steal from people, again, that mirroring idea, the eighth and the fourth, right? Like one of the ways that we don't steal from God, from ourselves, from our family, from our employer, is by actually taking a break, by actually resting. Because if, the village church pays me money to do my job, if I am just working 24/7 and just grinding out, in a way, I'm stealing from them, because I'm going to burn myself out. And then in 1 year, 10 years, whatever it is, I'm just going to be so exhausted I can't do any work at all. And so like I'm in a sense stealing from my employer, right? Or stealing from people who are paying for me. And you can go different ways with that. But like Sabbath is really important for us to not be enslaved to, I think he talks about like the God of mammon, right? Or the God of money, the God of wealth. But we rest and say, I don't need what this money can give me. I really just need the Lord, and I need what he can provide, and he will provide.
At the top of page 99, I think, as you mentioned, that God of mammon, that so many of us are enslaved to, that last verse in the first paragraph. Sooner or later, like every idol, it leaves us with speechless mouths, blind eyes, and deaf ears. I think I just stopped reading at that point and was like, I'm done.
it might have been the paragraph before that also, at the bottom of 98. It feels like he wrote this a little prophetically, where he says, the eighth commandment parallels the third. Theft is practical idolatry, service to mammon, one of our world's most revered idols. More than power, money is the god of Wall Street and K Street, Pennsylvania Avenue. Our polity is organized to maximize GDP. When disaster strikes, we do our patriotic duty by buying more stuff enabled by smartphones that allow us to shop anytime, anywhere. Advertisements bombard us with enticements to believe, contrary to Jesus, that life consists in the abundance of possessions. Think about the last 3 months, last 4 months, and what it has meant to try and safeguard provisions and a rush on things of security is going to be how I can provide for daily needs. And it's a lack of trust in a lot of areas. It's preparedness. Again, as a person who likes to be prepared, there's like, be wise, but there's also like there's a selfishness of self-preservation. Like there's a self-preservation that comes in there. There's a willingness to put oneself over another.
Yeah.
And that has to really be guarded, because that's mammon, I think, at a base.
Yeah. And he talks about guarding it on 99, and to acknowledge that ultimately we break mammon's hold when we acknowledge that all we have is a gift from God.
Yes.
And so sometimes all we have and all we are belongs to the Lord, which I think it's a quote on 100. I think, Mason, I don't want to steal your thunder because you wanted to talk about
No,
this.
go ahead. Take the thunder.
Take the thunder. But this, like, the whole mammon quote had me down on the couch. And then when I got back up and I read this one, I was down again. And he says, in the first paragraph on page 100. The fruit of the tree of knowledge was the one thing that belonged exclusively to God. Adam stole it, and all children of Adam are thieves, stealing God's holy things, assaulting God's image by assaulting the property of others. Above all, we steal ourselves from God. We are not our own. We were bought at a price. We bear the name that marks us as the Lord's property, yet we want to be our own God. Every time we disobey, we steal and commit sacrilege, misusing God's holy things. Basically, just about
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it, guys. We're done tonight. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
But to have,
yeah, I mean, yeah.
Go ahead, Mason.
No, after you, to have the perspective.
I think to have the perspective that all I have and all I am belongs to the Lord in a culture that pushes you to say, you do whatever you want to do because you basically are the captain of your own ship, boat, whatever. And it's just, it's literally the other direction. That our motivation for not doing things are not our emotions, are not our personal pleasure or satisfaction, or not even that it brings us a better life, but that I go where the Lord sends me and do what he tells me to do and use my resources that benefit his people and his kingdom because I'm here to be used by him. To me, it's just, it's game changing.
It's just an open-handedness and a humility to say, I'm not my own. I serve the Lord. He made me. I'm his. Therefore, how I steward myself and who I am, like I just am not my own. Like it is countercultural to say the least.
Yeah. And I think I love how Whiteheart draws theft all the way back to the Garden of Eden as this thing that humans are always struggling with. And when I read this paragraph, I immediately thought of Augustine's Confessions. If you've ever read that book, which I would highly recommend, classic work in the church, history of the church. Augustine taught, like there's this really famous scene where Augustine steals pears and how he's stealing this fruit. And he talks later about it, like he's not a Christian at this time. He's just stealing, like with his friends, stealing this fruit. And he says, like, I didn't even want it. I wasn't even hungry. Like, I don't even know if he liked pears. Like, he didn't want the fruit for the fruit, but he was just doing it to disobey. And like that, I think, is one of the impulse of the human sick, sinful heart is to want to just disobey in some way. And one of the ways that we do that is through theft, of Adam being the representative of those who are in Adam, those who are apart from Christ, who are stealing from God, who God says, hey, don't take this thing. And we want to take it anyway, not because we actually want the thing for itself, but we just want to disobey God. But I love how he draws to that, of saying that Adam stole from the tree. Don't steal from the tree. Yeah. Why? Because Jesus didn't account equality with God a thing to be stolen, a thing to be grasped or seized, right? But Jesus laid down his life. He saw his life as a gift. He saw everything he had as a gift. He saw his time and his resources and his money. And so he's not stealing from his neighbor, from his family, by hoarding it and spending it all on himself. But he gives to others. And that's what makes him righteous.
Amen.
It's a great place to end for the night. We're right at 9. So, hey friends, thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks for the conversation, for the comments that you put in the chat and engaging with us. This has been a lot of fun, and we've got one more of these next week. I'm hopeful. I think we might have a special guest, and so we'll see if that happens or not. Tune in next week. And I hope that you've enjoyed this book. So we've got just a couple more chapters left, and then we will be working through the end of the book next Monday night. Same time, same place. You'll find the link on Instagram. Nathan will put it up for us. So we are so thankful to get to do this with you. Thanks for joining in on our conversation. Nathan and Elizabeth, it's good to see you and talk with you as always. Yeah. And have a good night. Okay, bye. Crystal's going to hit the button and it's like in 15 seconds. So we'll just keep talking to each other.